For obvious reasons, Germany has been squeamish these last 8 decades about being seen to flex its military muscle abroad. For equally obvious reasons, Germany is having to conquer this reluctance. This week, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz visited Lithuania ahead of the arrival of a brigade of the Bundeswehr to the tiny Baltic Republic. It will be the first permanent deployment of German troops outside Germany's borders since World War II. The German brigade, formed of the 203rd Panzers and the 122nd Armoured Infantry, along with troops already in Lithuania, will be there to forestall one particular nightmare scenario: an attempt by Russia to extend its present revanchist tantrum in Ukraine to other parts of the former Soviet Union and/or Russian Empire. A move on one or all of the 3 Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia, would be a terrifying raising of the stakes. All 3 countries are members of Nato and therefore entitled to the protection of Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, the so-called all for one, one for all clause. Article 5 has only been invoked once in NATO's 75-year history, on behalf of the United States after the Al-Qaeda attacks of September 11th, 2001. It has never been seriously tested by the adversary that NATO was originally designed to deter: Russia. How likely is a Russian attack on the Baltics? What more should be done to discourage it? And is Germany, at last, getting over itself? This is the Foreign Desk.
I don't see Europe in the near future being able to defend its territory without the assistance of the United States. I don't see that happening. I don't think that we have yet sent a clear signal to European industries that we're serious about defending ourselves. Because now we talk, many high words and, wishes and, ambitions, factories, jobs, guns, ammunition, tanks, planes. This is what is needed.
The brigade is meant to be ready by 2027, which is such a key time for NATO because that's around the time when a lot of military forward planning assumes that the Russian military could be reconstituted to a significant level. And also, if you think about the big rethink that had to take place in Germany among military personnel, among the public, among politicians, then I think we really shouldn't underestimate what that means for the future.
Putin has always said he was the man who described the most appropriate security settlement for Europe as a new Yalta. I'm in no doubt that he wants to rebuild another Russian empire. I'm in no doubt that he's got the Baltic states in his sights. The one thing that is going to make him think about it is the fact that they are now part of NATO. And if they were not part of NATO, I'm pretty sure that Russian troops would have been hammering at the gates of Vilnius, Riga and Tallinn by now.
You're listening to The Foreign Desk. I'm Andrew Muller. Our first guest is Gabrielius Landsbergis, the Foreign Minister of Lithuania, who we met earlier this week at the Lithuanian Embassy in London. Landsbergis had recently told the country's national broadcaster, LRT, that he thought Russia attacking Europe was a question of 5 to 10 years. I began by asking the minister where he got that timescale from.
The calculation that we are having comes from a very simple fact, that many experts used to say that it would take for Russia, 5 to 10 years to rebuild, its military forces. What we're seeing currently is that Russia has rebuilt already. Actually, it has more troops in Ukraine and in the whole military system than it had before the war. Before the war, it did not have, a war economy. Now it does have. When a steamroller like that, when it starts rolling, it's not easy to stop. There is a price to stopping this. And in systems like Russia's, authoritarian systems, the shifts like that, you have to convince your people that this is the right shift. Starting a war and then coming out of the war. So this is where the calculation comes from. This is where the danger comes from, that Russia, with this massive wartime engine, troops and equipment and machines and whatever, they won't be ready to stop.
Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, has been visiting Lithuania, foreshadowing the arrival of a brigade of the Bundeswehr, which won't see, as I understand it, full readiness till 2027. But that's still nearly 5,000 German troops. It's a considerable force. How reassured are you by that German presence and also by Chancellor Scholz talking of, as he put it, unwavering support for the Baltics and his invocation of Article 5 in particular?
Well, I think that it's such a strategic step, both for Germany and Lithuania, and I would say even for NATO. Because, first of all, it's a bilateral decision. It's a bilateral commitment, even though it comes in under the umbrella. But the decision did not come from the NATO military planning that obliged Germans to do this thing. So it was a German political decision that they see themselves as taking responsibility in Lithuania, defending Lithuania together with our troops from the, what we call the 0 second, right? From the moment when it doesn't even start, right? Just before it starts. So it's a change for them. Germany has never had a permanent presence outside Germany. It's a change for us. We've never had a contingent of that size in Lithuania, and it's a change for NATO because, after the end of Cold War, in Europe, within Europe, there has never been movement of that size and commitment. It's a big thing. And also, it is a message to Russians that everything that you're doing, we're seeing it and we're preparing. It works as a deterrent.
Are you completely confident, though, about Article 5 and your NATO partners' commitment to it? Because it's not difficult to imagine what the nightmare scenario is. You have Russia making some sort of possibly even semi-deniable foray into the Baltic states, maybe biting off a town like Narva or Klaipėda in Estonia or Latvia and saying, there's the gauntlet down. Are we really fighting World War III over this?
I'm not worried about Article 5. And about the planning and everything. I mean, there are probably the most professional people on it, foreseeing the way that it would play out. But obviously the character of war is changing. And what we're seeing now is mostly this hybrid area, that you mentioned yourself, right? We're seeing GPS jamming.
This is of flights around the Baltic states.
Yeah. I mean, is it of military domain or not? It affects civilian flights. It affects military flights in the Baltics, in Poland, UK. Flights have been affected by this as well. So, how do we deal with that? Then there are, factory fires. Then there are hybrid activities in the Baltics. There are people apprehended who are, working and, planning and operating in NATO area. Is this, again, is it military domain? Is it NATO domain? Do you have article for that? I believe that what we're seeing is Russia becoming more assertive and actively avoiding something that they know that we have planned and testing different scenarios that we might not have planned and prepared for. And therefore, we have to be actively preparing for some different warfare and obviously drawing lines. This is not okay, and this is seen, and there will be repercussions for the things like that.
Does that faith you expressed in Article 5 change if there is a change of government in the United States in November?
So far, there is no real indication that anybody should be worried. Mostly what we are talking in Lithuania, that we would be sure that we've done our part. This is the main concern. We cannot influence, the outcome of another country's election. And publicly worrying about the outcome does not help anything. So the only thing that we can do and should be ready to do is really do our part. So therefore, spending, now we spend 2.7%, but we believe that is not enough. With the purchases that we are, that we are planning, we need more air defense, we need more, heavy equipment, we need more. How much more? 3%, maybe 3.5%, how to get there. We need more people that would know how to use arms, that would be ready to defend our country. And these things do offer not just a security, guarantee to us as a country, but also as an argument for others. Why Germany should defend Lithuania? Because Lithuanians are doing really everything that they can, 120%. It is a strong argument. The same would work for the United States if they would ever start reconsidering, not necessarily Article 5 or NATO, but, force posture in Europe or, the way that they present the forces. Look, we need you to stay. And we are doing everything that we can possibly, but this last mile, we cannot cover it just because we're too small. And this is where we need United Kingdom, we need United States, we need Germany, we need France, and other big players in NATO.
And you also do have, though, just across your southern border, Poland. Are you reassured at all by the extent of their military ambitions? Because Poland, as you know, has plans of becoming an extremely serious military power.
Well, it's a reassurance for us. Poland is a strategic ally for us in the region. Just take any movement of troops from Germany, they have to go through Poland, right? So for us, having this complete interlink within the government institutions, within the militaries, within the politicians, between the two countries, it's crucial. And for us, the belief is that the stronger the Poland is, the more safe and secure we are.
But are the Baltics better protected if more of Europe follows Poland's example, adheres, I guess, to this idea of President Emmanuel Macron of France's, of strategic autonomy, as he puts it, this idea that Europe has to be willing and, perhaps more importantly, able to look after itself if the United States does hang it out to dry at some point in the future?
I don't see Europe in the near future being able to defend, let alone its strategic interests, but its territory without the assistance of the United States. I don't see that happening.
But does that need to change, do you think? I mean, Europe is a significant economic power bloc. Obviously, it should be able to look after itself, shouldn't it?
It is. I mean, but there are steps that need to be taken before we can, set out to this goal. First, let's talk seriously about the industry. And I don't think that we have yet sent a clear signal to European industries that we're serious about defending ourselves. That the factories are not at the capacity, as in Russia, not even as the United States. So let's take all the air of that we use to produce the words and put it into factories and let them, start rolling. Because now we talk, many high words and, wishes and, ambitions, factories, jobs, guns, ammunition, tanks, planes. This is what is needed. If we see that ambition getting realized, this is where I can say, okay, Europe is standing up. Because, I mean, it's silly. The danger is here. The threat is in Europe. The war is in Europe. And we are talking about something that, is not yet materializing. I think it's, we need to get moving.
Are you concerned, though, ultimately, that at some point of crisis, the Baltics could be regarded as somehow expendable? It wouldn't be the first time, of course.
Not this time.
What makes you say that?
Because the way that the security architecture is formed with Article 5 is that the reliability of the West itself hangs on the smallest city in Lithuania.
But that's in theory. In practice?
For an investor that sees, Washington Treaty not upheld, and which treaty can you trust?
That was Gabrielius Landsbergis, the Foreign Minister of Lithuania. You're listening to The Foreign Desk. This is The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. In the weeks after Russia attacked Ukraine in February 2022, Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz seemed to grasp that his country needed to make two considerable adjustments. One, detaching Germany from Russian energy was tough, but largely logistical. The other was more psychological and therefore possibly more difficult, accepting the military responsibilities Germany had spent several decades avoiding. Well, I'm joined now by Dr. Marion Messmer, Senior Research Fellow in International Security at Chatham House. Marion, let's start with the figure of Chancellor Olaf Scholz. There has been a perception over the last couple of years that Germany has wavered, that Germany isn't reliable, that Germany just basically wants all this to stop. Is that entirely fair?
I don't think that's entirely fair. I think there are a few different things at play here. I think Olaf Scholz could have a better communication style for sure, because there are different things that various ministries have done that just haven't been communicated as clearly and as effectively as possible. Some of the quotes we've seen from him are very vague, like very evasive. And he keeps coming back to the same language around Germany standing side by side with other allies and that sort of thing. But people pick up on that if it's always the same language. And I think he gets a maybe slightly unfair reputation for being a bit vague. When you actually look at numbers of the kind of support that Germany has provided to Ukraine, it's a very different story. And I think the other thing that's at play here is that for a long time, Germany has had the reputation because of its history that it wasn't that comfortable with military operations. It's very new for Germany to have military abroad and to use its military in that way. And until fairly recently, a lot of NATO allies actually wouldn't have been that comfortable with a strong German military presence. So Germany very quickly had to get used to the fact that now its allies wanted to be a military presence, which hasn't been 100% comfortable for some parliamentarians. So debates that took place either at the public level or in parliament ended up, I think, tainting the overall picture of how ready Germany is to take the step, which I think if we look at, figures of the amount of money spent on military capabilities or support given for Ukraine, Germany is doing a lot better than, for example, France, which doesn't quite get the same reputation or critiques that Germany gets.
I do want to come back to the whole hangover of history angle on this, because it clearly does still guide a lot of Germany's decision-making around the use of its military. But to go back to the figure of Scholz, do you think at various points over the last couple of years, when we talk about his messaging and communications, he's perhaps just got a bit nervous? Because when I think back to the beginning of this crisis in early 2022, he gave that, extraordinary speech talking about a Zeitenwende, a complete rethinking of how Germany would see its place in Europe and its place in the world, how it would step up to help defend Europe, it would unplug itself from Russian energy, and everybody was thinking, oh my God, Germany really gets it. But he's rarely been quite so clear since.
I think he's a very careful politician. It's been really interesting looking at the contrast between him and President Macron in France, because really, I think if you want the perhaps best approach to Russia or the best kind of political messaging, you would end up somewhere between the two. But you've got on the one hand Olaf Scholz being extremely careful, extremely considerate and very slow to make certain points. And then on the other hand, you've got Macron, who's much more brash, much more aggressive, much more sort of forward-pushing in his messaging. And I think some of that is political style. I mean, if you look at Olaf Scholz's political history, he's always been that kind of politician, even during his time in Hamburg. So in some ways, it's perhaps not unexpected, but it's perhaps not the ideal chancellor for such a crisis time.
As you were alluding earlier, this brigade of the Bundeswehr, which is being sent to Lithuania, will be the first permanent stationing of German troops abroad since World War II. Obviously, the last time German troops were in Lithuania was in vastly different circumstances. But is it possible to express how, hesitant or nervous a lot of Germany still is about such an idea? And I'm thinking back now to late 2022, talking to an extremely senior former German diplomat at the Warsaw Security Forum. And this was at a time when Germany was getting beaten up a bit for not sending Leopard tanks that Ukraine was asking for. And he did say, you have to understand that for a lot of German people, the spectacle of Leopard tanks, as he put it, Panzers, being loaded onto trains and sent east to fight the Russians, does bring up an awful lot of stuff that Germany is still very uncomfortable with.
Absolutely. And it's really such a sea change. I mean, if we think about other times that Germany in recent history has been abroad militarily, there was such a reluctance in German politics to call the involvement of the German military in Afghanistan, Germany being at war in any way, which caused a lot of issues with civil-military relations when soldiers died in action, and the defense ministry at the time couldn't quite get its language right in acknowledging what it was that those families had lost and the circumstances under which those soldiers died. So I think, given that that was so recently, it is still astonishing to me to what extent Germany has been able to embrace this new challenge. But at the same time, there's, of course, more still to come. I mean, even if we think about how this NATO forward deployment has changed from the battle group size to now brigade size, I mean, that's huge in terms of numbers. And Germany stepping up to be one of the framework nations for that is also really significant. I mean, it's of course a bit funny if you look at the announcement and, at first I think it was like something like 20-something soldiers that are being sent out of the eventual 5,000. So you can laugh at that a little bit. But on the other hand, the brigade is meant to be ready by 2027, which is such a key time for NATO, because that's around the time when a lot of military forward planning assumes that the Russian military could be reconstituted to a significant level. So in that sense, is actually extremely quickly, given how military timelines sometimes are. And also, if you think about the big rethink that had to take place in Germany among military personnel, among the public, among politicians, then I think we really shouldn't underestimate what that means for the future. Because even if there might be challenges or even if there might be debates now, I think this is a permanent change in Germany that will reverberate for decades to come.
Do you detect a change within Germany in attitudes towards Germany's military? Because obviously in most countries, certainly in most NATO countries, the military is more or less uncritically revered. Everybody admires their soldiers, admires their air force and their sailors. Germany obviously has a huge cleavage in its history between 1945 and now. Has the German military now entirely escaped that? Is it regarded as an aspirational vocational profession, something that the best and brightest want to go into?
I don't think the change has been quite that extreme, but there has been a change. Fairly recently, there was still a debate over whether serving soldiers are entitled to use German public transport for free. And the decision was that they were, but they had to be in uniform so that you could recognize them essentially. And there was a bit of a public outcry over seeing soldiers, for example, returning back to where they were serving after a weekend at home, for example. People were really uncomfortable with seeing military personnel in uniform on public transport. Whereas apparently this has changed somewhat now, where people now, smile at soldiers on trains and that kind of thing. It's of course a slow change. And I think also, the other really interesting thing is that until fairly recently, the German military within the country was also seen as a sort of technical support unit. So if there was a natural disaster or something like that, the military would come and, for example, fill sandbags if there was flooding somewhere. There are concerns that with the increased requirements from NATO, the German military is no longer going to be able to step up in those kind of domestic situations. But of course, that's also not a very cost-effective way of using one's military. So I don't think that's necessarily a problem. But the shift from thinking about soldiers as, maybe technical personnel who help in an emergency situation to actually being defense personnel is quite significant, and that change is definitely going on at the moment.
Let's return finally to the figure of Chancellor Scholz, who I think it's fair to say, despite everything he has done and said, isn't all the way there yet, most obviously in his refusal to authorise Taurus long-range missiles for Ukraine. And that prompts the question, just finally, and going back again to the degree to which Germany is still burdened by its history, do you think there has been perhaps a tendency for modern Germany to hide behind this a little bit, to sort of try and sit out its responsibilities in terms of defending Europe because it's trying to duck the responsibility almost by saying we can't really be trusted?
Yes and no. I think yes, of course, in the sense that Germany has one of the biggest GDPs in Europe and therefore is also expected to really step up in a NATO context. But also no in the sense that the German reunification only happened, roughly 35 years ago. And at that point still, there was a lot of nervousness in NATO over reunified Germany, what that would mean for European security. That's not even a human lifetime ago. So I think that tension between Germany needing to be a military force and also seeing European partners being actually really nervous about what that means is really difficult. And most of the current leadership in Germany at the moment has been trained in the post-World War II environment where people were much more hesitant about militarism, about military force, about military capabilities. So it is a really big unlearning. As I mentioned earlier, I think the change is going to be permanent in Germany. I mean, some of the changes that have been made to defense spending are going to be very long-acting, very long-lasting in terms of increasing Germany's capabilities. And so I think there's going to be a generational shift that will take place. But of course, for the time being, that means that Germany now finds itself in a position where actually its partners now see it differently, see it as a democracy, see it as a partner and wanting to step up. But there is this internal tension over whether that feels right, whether that's something that's in line with German values. And I think looking at the Green Party is actually really interesting there because traditionally that's a very pacifist party in Germany. But they have been in power at two very key moments for Germany's reckoning with its military position. Once, in the 90s during the Kosovo crisis, where Germany ended up supporting NATO's involvement there. And then now again, where we've got the very decisive moment for European security of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I think in both of those moments, Green Party politicians have stepped up in a way that no one expected. So if that can be taken as a bellwether of general sort of progressive German thought on the role of the military and the role of Germany when it comes to security policy globally. That's a really interesting shift, and I think that's going to be permanent.
Marion, thank you for joining us. That was Dr. Marion Messmer, Senior Research Fellow in International Security at Chatham House. This is The Foreign Desk. You're listening to The Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. Finally, on this week's show, we'll consider the likelihood of Russia ever actually moving against the Baltics and the options if Russia does. I'm joined by the retired British General Sir Richard Shirreff, former Deputy Supreme Allied Commander at NATO, and the author of 2017 War with Russia, an urgent warning from senior military command, a novel which includes the scenario of a Russian invasion of Ukraine, prompting a war between Russia and NATO over the Baltic states. Sir Richard, let's examine the proposition itself, the idea of a Russian attack on one or more of the Baltic states. How likely do you think that really is?
Well, right now, as we speak, Russia is fixed in Ukraine. It might be moving forward. It's got the strategic initiative and it's on the move. But there's no way that Russia could attack the Baltic states now, less through missile, air, God forbid it, nuclear. I think it's highly unlikely. But I'm absolutely clear, and that's why I wrote the book postulating an attack on the Baltic states, I don't know what it was, 7 years ago now. It is absolutely in the Russian lexicon. They were all part of the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. They were not Soviet republics in the sense that they had signed up to the Soviet. They were annexed and taken over. And Putin has always said he was the man who described the most appropriate security settlement for Europe as a new Yalta. I'm in no doubt that he wants to rebuild another Russian empire. I'm in no doubt that he's got the Baltic states in his sights. The one thing that is going to make him think about it is the fact that they are now part of NATO. And if they were not part of NATO, I'm pretty sure that Russian troops would have been hammering at the gates of Vilnius, Riga, and Tallinn by now. The long-term threat, though, is really there.
Notwithstanding their membership of NATO and notwithstanding the steps that are being taken, including this brigade of the Bundeswehr that is going to be deployed to Lithuania, are the Baltic states actually defendable if push does come to shove?
Well, a really important point. Up until pretty recently, NATO had no plans to defend the Baltic states, the idea being that if they were in any way attacked, NATO would launch a counteroffensive and retake them, which is a big, big hope because it would require an operation probably twice the size of D-Day to do something like that. Yeah, they are defendable, absolutely, if you've got the right numbers, the right capabilities, and the right force by land, air, and sea. But that requires a commitment by NATO to forward defense. Thus far, what we have seen is the enhanced forward battle groups deploy, one led by Britain in Estonia, by the Canadians in Latvia, and by the Germans in Lithuania. And at the NATO summit, I think it was last year or the year before, they said they should have a brigade. Well, Britain hasn't been able to step up to do a brigade. The Germans are. Actually, what you need is really strong in-place forces by land, sea, and air, an integrated defense plan that takes into account all three Baltic states with a single defense plan rather than individual Baltic states with their own defense plans, which can be picked off piecemeal. But you also need a really comprehensive, well-rehearsed, well-practiced NATO reinforcement plan to build up along the lines that NATO had during the Cold War with Reforger, when the Americans were prepared to, at the drop of a hat, send really significant forces across the Atlantic to reinforce the Central Front.
If the Baltics, though, are in theory defendable, I guess in conventional terms, if that level of commitment is taken for granted, does that defend them at all against, I guess, perhaps even an escalation of what we've already seen from Russia? That there's been cyber attacks. We've seen these reports of them jamming GPS signals and affecting flights around the Baltics. There's been various reports of various sabotage operations. Is there anything that's going to stop Russia from doing any of that?
No, not at all. And it's absolutely in the Russian lexicon to do that. And it's conducted such attacks in Estonia. That cyber attack in the thousands. I can't remember the precise date. And don't forget, of course, that all the Baltic states have significant Russian-speaking ethnic minorities. I mean, Latvia and Estonia, it's around about 27% and 20%, respectively, less in Lithuania. And Putin claims a God-given right to protect the interests of Russians wherever they are, as he's demonstrated allegedly in eastern Ukraine, of course, although he's killed thousands of them in doing so, which is so bloody awful. But, the fact is that Russia, absolutely the way they would play it. And the only thing stopping Russia doing more than that right now is the extent to which they're fixed in Ukraine.
Is there an inbuilt weakness here, then, of the Article 5 idea, which is designed to guarantee a response to an assault upon a NATO member's territory? Because it's not unimaginable that if Russia or any other adversary really stepped up things like cyber attacks, sabotage, other proxy operations, they could render the targeted country more or less ungovernable and uninhabitable.
Great point. Of course, Article 5 says an armed attack on one should be deemed an armed attack on all. The question in 2024 is, what is an armed attack? Is it a cyber attack that takes down a state's financial machinery and infrastructure? Is it a cyber attack that destroys all power outlets, et cetera, et cetera? Now, I would hope that the North Atlantic Council is wargaming these sort of things. It should be thinking through, what does Article 5 mean in 2024? And if such an attack is launched against a member state, what is the NATO response? So they should be thinking this through, scenario testing around the North Atlantic Council table on a regular basis, if nothing more than to generate and develop the sort of intellectual muscle memory to allow them to kick in and respond should such an eventuality happen.
But in such an eventuality, and this is drawing upon your own experience of working at NATO at a very high level, who actually decides whether or not this meets the Article 5 threshold?
Well, ultimately, it's going to be the NATO heads of state and the NATO nations. Every nation has a NATO ambassador, an ambassador in Brussels, and they meet on a regular basis, 2, 3, 4, as many times a week as they need to. So ultimately, it will be the North Atlantic Council that makes the decision.
If we throw it ahead a few years, and I guess this is going back to the scenario you outlined in your book, you said earlier that Russia is for the moment tied down in Ukraine. Were that to change for any reason, does that all of a sudden make the Baltics predicament much more acute?
Yes, without question. And if Russia achieved victory in Ukraine, as they are determined to do, as they will never give up that idea until Russia is defeated in Ukraine, which requires, it's another question, but it requires a fundamental mindset shift from NATO and a NATO strategy to support them. If Putin was able to declare victory in Ukraine, no question that he would reset, rebuild, regain, reconstitute his armed forces and have another go at finishing off what he's done in Ukraine and then moving on to Moldova, finishing off in Georgia, and quite possibly having a go at the Baltic states as well.
General Sir Richard Shirreff, thank you very much for joining us here on the Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. That's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week, and look out for The Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Chris Chermak and Christy O'Grady. Christy also produces The Foreign Desk Explainer. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email Chris at cc@monocle.com, and don't forget to subscribe to Monocle magazine and our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Muller, thank you very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.